There we go. Okay, and everybody should also be able to enable captions if they need to as well. We're going to try and speak quite clearly and at a decent pace for those of us from Northern Ireland like myself. That's a big struggle. But anyway, you're all so very welcome here today, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Helen Flynn. I am the head of campaigns policy at research at JustFair. JustFair is a UK charity that works on economic, social, and cultural rights. That's your everyday rights like housing, healthcare, education across the whole of the UK. And we are here today as part of the UK Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Network to run this first substantial discussion session on human rights knowledge. We're so delighted to have you all here today. Just in terms of how the layout's going to work, we have four fabulous speakers who are going to give us some introductory remarks at the start. We'll go to each one for some of those. And then what we're going to do in the meat of this session is going to be a back and forth kind of discussion. So get your questions, get your thoughts, get your contributions ready as we go. Just though, before we start, I am going to run through, JustFair always has some ground rules when we do meetings, just so that we all know where we stand with things. So hopefully my screen share will work really smoothly. We'll see. Okay, so in terms of meeting ground rules, the purpose of these is to make sure that the events we run reflect a human rights-based approach where everybody is respected, they can participate fully, and where we're working to actively eliminate discrimination and promote equality and inclusivity. That includes by always being open for suggestions and feedback for improvement. And on that note, my colleague Alex is going to share a feedback form that I would really appreciate if people could fill in after this, because we really, really want to hear how this is going, and that will help shape where this series does go. But here's a few ground rules. Firstly, safety and well-being take priority. As noted in the email that we sent you with joining instructions, it might be that some of these conversations may be difficult, particularly with people who have lived or direct experience with some of these issues. But you need to always look after yourself first. And if that means, for example, needing to drop out of the session, please don't worry. Look after yourself and always make sure that your safety and well-being are taking priority. We respect and we value difference. We know that people are coming from really different backgrounds and really different experiences. We at JustFair think that actually makes our work so much stronger. So it's not just that we think we need to respect and value difference, it's that we really think it's an important thing and we're so grateful to have it. All opinions count. So again, we're coming from a diversity of experiences. Some of that experience is through things we've lived, some of it's through what we've read, some of it's a mixture of both, or the many different ways in which people experience things and gain knowledge. And we just recognise that that comes in many forms, knowledge and expertise. This is a safe space for learning. We're not always going to get everything right, but what we really value at JustFair is the idea that we're all on our human rights journey and we're all trying to do a little better every time. We will actively listen and improve. Again, for us, a lot of that is about our feedback forms so that we can hear that. But we hope that everybody's committed to that, to actively listen to what people are saying and hearing them and hearing all of them. Be respectful. So I'm going to ask everybody to assume good intent, don't interrupt, and also respond to what's in front of you, not what you may imagine. We also only have 90 minutes for this discussion, so I'm going to ask that we really keep it tight to the topic, which is about rights knowledge and about how we can really bring our economic, social and cultural rights home into UK laws, legislation and practice. If we stray a bit, I might pull us back because I'll be chairing and moderating today. And finally, share the air. So that's about taking responsibility for helping sure everybody has time in the conversation and be conscious of who has and hasn't contributed. I know that can be really much more difficult in an online forum than if we were all sitting around in person, but just asking to be aware maybe if somebody hasn't spoken, they're looking forward to the opportunity. And that's it from me in terms of ground rules. And I don't want to waste too much time with me talking, but just to say our next session is going to take place on the 20th of March. And it's going to be looking at human rights frameworks. I think Alex will drop a link to it into the chat there. We also are delighted to announce that we have a new resources page for this project. So All the resources, all the documents, the presentations, the recording, and a summary of last month's session are now all available on that webpage, which I think, again, Alex is going to drop into the chat. And we have our feedback form. And finally, if you'd like to join that UK ESCR network, which this is being run through, I think Alex is also going to join a link. But no more from me for now. I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Kate Ewing. Kate is a researcher at JustFair, and alongside that work at JustFair, Kate is working on a PhD at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. And the focus of her work is work time and also the minimum wage. Kate previously worked in London as a labour rights solicitor, representing trade unions and their members. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Helen, and hi everybody. It's great to see so many people joining us today. I'm just going to see if I can get my slides to work. There we go. So yeah, as Helen said, today we're going to be talking about rights knowledge. And this is part of a series of discussions that we are having at JustFair, because we've been thinking about what measures and policies would be needed for incorporation of economic, social and cultural rights to happen across the UK. And so just very briefly as an introduction, we think there are 5 principles which are helpful for structuring our discussions and thinking around this issue of incorporation of rights, so that we can start to imagine and build the practical measures and policies that could guarantee everyday rights for everyone across all of the UK. And so the 5 principles that we've identified at JustFair are rights knowledge, rights frameworks, rights resourcing, rights accountability, and rights enjoyment. And today we're going to talk about our first principle, which is rights knowledge. And we're going to have some further discussion sessions in the coming weeks on the other principles. But if you are interested and you want to know a little bit more sort of as an introduction, there's information available on our website, and we're setting up resource pages as Helen has mentioned. So focusing on rights knowledge, I thought it would be helpful to get the discussion started by outlining what we've been thinking about at JustFair in relation to this and what we think it might mean and involve. So we see rights knowledge as an underpinning core concept for rights protection. Ensuring broad rights knowledge for everyone requires ongoing accessible education provision and sources of information to build the collective knowledge and expectation of rights protection in relation to everyday issues which affect people living in the UK, whether that relates to their wages, their health, housing, education, amongst other issues. And when we talk about rights, knowledge and education, at JustFair, we think this means both knowledge about the substantive rights themselves and also the structures and processes which relate to them. So in relation to the rights themselves, this means knowing what the rights are. For example, that the issue experienced is one of a right to a decent wage or an adequate standard of living or to health. It means knowing whose rights they are, so rights holders know their rights and feel confident to claim them. It means rights bearers knowing what the rights are and how they relate to their responsibilities so they can fulfill their rights obligations in decision making. And it also means people who may not be in a particular situation, may not be decision makers nor direct rights holders, but who play a role in delivering or administering rights, and that they understand them and the role they play in their work and ensuring that they're respected. When we talk about the structures and processes, we're talking about the systems in place which make rights work in practice. So that will include complaints mechanisms and routes for remedy for when things go wrong. And so that involves people knowing what these processes and mechanisms are, how and where to access them, and how to navigate them. And this deeper knowledge of rights, both the substantive and the structural knowledge, by all people impacted and involved has a role in protecting them and ensuring that the rights are incorporated into the day-to-day reality for everyone. Rights knowledge has both a preventative and a responsive effect. So what I mean by that is that it's preventative in that if people know that the issue they're dealing with is a rights issue, they may be better able to expect and demand their rights. If decision makers are aware that they must proactively consider rights protections in decision making, that will build rights in from the outset. If people administering processes are conscious there is a rights element to their work, this all ought to combine to head off potential failures to protect rights before they occur. Increased knowledge has the further benefit of building wider solidarity and efforts to respect and help protect rights for everybody. But then when things don't go well and there is a failure to respect rights, knowledge of the systems for redress and remedy enables a responsive element to rights protection. So knowing where to turn, how to navigate the process so that complaints can be raised and resolved with effective remedy mechanisms is an important part of rights protection. And it's also something that we'll explore further in later discussion sessions. And so to that extent, the principles we're talking about are very much interlinked and interdependent. We're talking about knowledge today, but it's important to remind ourselves that it's just one important element of making rights incorporation a reality. And also on that point about things being linked and interwoven. And as a sort of final thought, what I've talked about today, of course, is underpinned to an extent by a structural presumption of a right to education, which is sufficiently accessible and realised to enable everybody to learn about, participate, and build towards collective rights knowledge. And I think that's probably something that's quite useful for us to think about in our discussion, is that the incorporation and protection of rights can't really be truly separated from the existence of access to rights in practice from the outset. And so I think that's why these discussion sessions involving as many people with as broad a range of experiences is key to developing proposals for rights incorporation in practice. And so I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and the sharing of ideas on what incorporation of economic, social, and cultural rights knowledge might look like, so that we can make rights protection work across all of the UK. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. And without further ado, I'm just going to pass straight on to Anmol Kaur Singh. And Anmol is an ambassador for Change for Children's Rights. Anmol holds a master's degree in law and has particular expertise in children's rights and also youth participation. Anmol is a committed advocate and champion for young people and is dedicated to effecting positive change. So I'm going to pass to you, Anmol. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. As Helen kindly introduced, my name is Anmol. I'm here today to speak to you about my reflections, learning, and the importance, in my opinion, of a young person knowing about their rights. Now, I said I'm happy to be here, which I am, but I would much rather be speaking about how my children's rights were upheld rather than the fact that they were breached, and how that then went on to influence and play a big part in my life. And so given that my theme or title of my talk today is The Reality and the Dream, I thought by having a theme, it would help to shape my discussion today. As Helen knows, when I'm really passionate about something, I can ramble on and I want to stick to time and I don't want, we'll be here all day. So I think every child and young person should be educated in their rights. Not only that, but understand the impact and the outcomes of this, what to do if you feel that they're not being upheld, how to get support. In an ideal world, I'd like every young person to have a personalized action plan so they're not subject to further trauma. Just quickly, a show of hands. You can use the hand feature on Zoom or just put your hand up. If you cast your mind back to when you were a child, it might be a long time ago for some, but can you remember if you were taught about your rights, specifically children's rights? So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, were you taught about it at school? So yeah, that's interesting. I don't think anyone put their hand up. And if anybody did, then you were one of the lucky few. Unfortunately, many young people aren't so lucky, and it shouldn't be a case of luck at all. It's currently not on the school curriculum. And in fact, had I not been involved in extracurricular activities and volunteering outside of school time, I would also not have known my rights either. I mean, you kind of know the basics, right to life, right to education. And in fact, as a child of an immigrant, it was instilled in me that these things I should be very grateful for, and that I should acknowledge my privilege being British and born in the UK, that I have an education and so on. So going my whole life thinking I was privileged and in a much better position than my family before me, not knowing that what I was experiencing was wrong. You can then imagine my shock to when, at the later age of 17, when I was working/volunteering as a youth councillor for my borough, I was shown the UNCRC child-friendly document. An organisation, a children's rights charity, came to talk to us about our rights and asked the same question I asked you earlier. Who here knows about this? I was ashamed. I didn't know how many there were. In fact, I didn't know that children had their own rights. Upon reading some, I felt upset. I thought, I don't have this or that. I thought to myself, what about my privilege? We're not in a third world country. I don't have the same struggles as the people before me. I'm meant to be much better off. Some of the rights that jumped out to me included Article 3, Best Interests of the Child, 12, Respect for Children's Views, 27, Right to Food, Clothing, and Safe Home. I then later took this anger and turned it into a feeling of drive. Actually, I don't want this to happen to me or other young people. A couple of years prior, my sister was born when I was 15, who I now care for. She was and is the light of my life. She made me see things from her eyes, a baby with a fresh outlook to the world, a vulnerable child that deserves to be protected and cared for, as does every child. As I said, I then took this experience and turned it into a passion to make a change. I became an advocate for children and young people while still being a young person myself. I went on to study law at university and then a master's in law to pursue this, to give myself that knowledge that I didn't have. I spoke in Parliament with decision makers about my experiences and what needs to change. I was on the panel for the Children's Rights Inquiry back in 2016, and then subsequently went on to manage the inquiry and make space for other young people to be on the panel every year after this. One of which at the last inquiry in 2023 was my sister. She was on the panel. Very much full circle, a very proud, definitely overwhelming feeling. I volunteered with charities, I created reports, I spoke at roundtable discussions with world leaders. I went on to speak in the United Nations in Geneva, New York. With the value in knowing my rights, I was able to use them to fight or campaign for myself and other young people. I was able to have my voice heard and took seriously as Article 12 and 13 of the UNCRC state. And now, although I'm no longer a child, I still very much advocate for them, and I work with vulnerable young people to ensure that the baton is passed on. The value in involving young people, having discussions with them, is still very much not acknowledged and should definitely not be overlooked. I would encourage you all to think about how you can incorporate youth engagement in your work. So I want to finish by asking you to picture something, and if you like, do close your eyes to imagine this. So scenario A, there's a 12-year-old girl who has just started in a new school, as well as all the different changes in her life that come with teenagehood and personal troubles. She's also unfortunately subject to bullying. Her living situation is compromised by no fault of her own. She grows up without a place to call home. The local authority breaches the legal limit of 6 weeks in a bed and breakfast temporary accommodation. She ends up staying in unsanitary, unsafe, cold and damp conditions. She lives in poverty with little to no support, finding it hard to make it to the next day. Despite all this, she is ambitious and studious. However, her mental health is knocked down. She doesn't have a place to sit down, study at home to complete her homework, so she gets told off at school. She doesn't have a space to play and invite friends round. She finds it difficult to navigate life and doesn't feel well supported or that anyone cares what she has to say. And now scenario B, the same 12-year-old girl, ambitious, studious, except now she's empowered. She knows her rights as they were taught to her from a very young age at school. She has a dedicated teacher, support worker, and a mentor. She gets the support that she's entitled to. She's no longer living in unlivable conditions. She's in secure housing. She has enough food and money to progress. She's able to create a safe environment for herself, which leads her to having a happy and healthy childhood. The young girl needs the support of everyone in this call, better support from the government and wider networks to grow in a healthy, loving, happy environment as every young person is entitled to, which is a life upholding the rights of the child. Now I'd invite you to open your eyes if you decided to close them. Out of the two scenarios, one was my reality and one was my dream. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Annabel. That was just wonderful. Just to keep us flowing, I am going to pass on now to Sanchita Holy. Sanchita is the CEO of the British Institute of Human Rights, BIHR, and they are a charity working across the UK that supports people and organisations to make practical social change through the everyday use of the Human Rights Act in areas such as health, care, social welfare, housing and education. Sanchita's expertise is in both the policy around and the practical application of human rights and equality law, having worked across the UK and internationally for more than 20 years. And I'm delighted to hand over to Sanchita.
Thank you so much, Helen. And gosh, that's one to follow. Thank you so much, Anmol. I'm going to set myself a timer to make sure I don't go over the time. I was thinking about kind of, what I would say around human rights knowledge, because I think one of the reasons that we are here, that kind of we've been asked to come, is to think about how we work with duty bearers, which is kind of something a little bit different to the conversation around human rights knowledge. We work kind of with individuals, and we also work with community groups as well, to ensure that people understand human rights. The framework we use is the Human Rights Act, but that they're able to implement that. And with individuals and community groups, that's kind of more about the rights claim, so being able to know, be empowered and claim your rights. And with duty bearers, that's kind of focused on recognising that individuals must kind of be able to know and claim their rights, but also they can't come up against a brick wall of those who have duties to support those human rights if they also don't know kind of what they're doing with human rights. Can I just check that everyone can see my screen? Because I've got you all, I haven't got my slides, I've got you all on my screen so I can see the faces, because it's much friendlier as a presenter. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of that work that we do, working to increase the accountability of duty bearers around human rights. So as I've said, we use the Human Rights Act, but our focus is kind of recognising that that's about universal human rights, and also about recognising that human rights are not solely about the courtrooms. For us, it's about kind of the two pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So it's about connecting individuals, ensuring that they're empowered to know and claim their rights, but also that the public bodies, the officials, the face of the state, who has those human rights duties, that they are able to be accountable and uphold those. And a key sort of focus of the way we work is this idea of a human rights culture, which was one of the aims of our Human Rights Act, which is the kind of UK legislation that we can sort of track back through the European Convention and all the way to the Universal Declaration, if you look at its introduction. And this is what the Parliament's Human Rights Committee said about what a culture of respect for human rights is. So they talked about it as being human rights being an integral part of our way of life, our reference point for dealing with those public authorities, those duty bearers, where policies and practices are influenced by those ideas, and that a human rights culture isn't just about courts awarding remedies for violations, but actually there's this whole piece of preventative work. So this whole idea that actually decision makers internalise those requirements of human rights law, so that all of our interactions with the kind of state, whoever that is, whether that is, a social worker, a housing officer, a police officer, that actually that's informed by human rights considerations as well. And so for us, kind of that thinking about working with duty bearers as well as rights holders is that, yes, people should be able to kind of know and claim their rights. but that actually you can't just rely solely on people who are experiencing rights violations to be the primary claimers of their rights, that we need kind of a system approach which supports those individuals to have that human rights knowledge, but also supports the individuals who are operating all of those public bodies with duties to uphold our human rights, that those individuals also have that human rights knowledge. And the anchor of the Human Rights Act has been really clear. If we're kind of thinking about longer term, sort of what are the mechanisms that can enable that. For us as an organisation, the fact that there is a specific legal duty in the Human Rights Act, which is about those faces of the state respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights, is the anchor for getting that knowledge into those public bodies and then transforming that into action. So I think one of the kind of barriers around human rights knowledge is that, particularly in the UK, is the idea that human rights are a really nice thing to do. They're nice and they're kind, but they're also optional extras. So actually having it in the law, in the legal framework, that's the bit that you can really use as the lever for change with the duty bearers. In the same way that they have lots of other legal duties, they have this legal duty too. And in the way that the Human Rights Act operates, or the way it should operate, if they have the knowledge, is that all other laws also need to be applied in a way that is respectful of human rights. So there's some really important kind of thinking, I think, around what the mechanisms are in order to enable the knowledge around human rights with duty bearers. But all of that's only possible if duty bearers actually know that they have these human rights duties and what they are. So at BRHR, we work with a really broad range of those public bodies, from kind of local authorities, city councils, county councils, kind of national and devolved governments, NHS trusts, ombudsmen, commissioners of public services, but also the direct delivery of those services in healthcare and social welfare, in housing. And we have this kind of model that we use, which is trying to really think about all the different aspects of what is needed for that human rights knowledge. So the idea that we kind of meet people where they are, we map kind of what they're working on to human rights. We kind of don't just go in there sort of saying, you need to know about human rights, and then kind of do a legal lecture. That's never going to get you kind of far. It's actually about how you work with people in a way that works with them to understand the law in practice. So I won't kind of go over that too much, but maybe there'll be questions. But what I did kind of just want to finish on was what we know about need in the UK, and also kind of what that means for knowledge development with duty bearers. So almost no duty bearers have mandatory training on human rights. So they have the duty to support our human rights, but they have no educational capacity. It's not a requirement. It's kind of not needed or seen as needed for their jobs. That there is a need across all levels, from frontline staff right up through to management and leaders, and even more so in the difficult kind of climate that we find ourselves in now. And that even if human rights are mentioned in a strategy, it doesn't mean that that's what's happening at an operational level. And also at an operational level, if that is happening in good practice, it also needs to be in the strategy to feed it all the way through. The final couple of points I'll just touch on is kind of what we know works. And the things that we know that work are kind of human rights being about universal standards, not us and them. I think it can be really difficult when you're working with duty bearers to see them as the enemy. But actually kind of this is about kind of universal principles that apply to everyone, that it's an ongoing process. It's not about training and one-off interventions, and really thinking about anchoring that in the law, in being accurate, thinking about kind of what implementation actually looks like, rooting it in real and kind of relevant issues that the people you're working with are experiencing. Acknowledging that human rights won't always solve everything, but they're a really important part of the puzzle, and really sharing those lived examples, those kind of examples of real life and lived experience. And we see that kind of really making changes at all different levels, whether it's everyday decision making, official policies, within teams, operations, leaders putting those strategic commitments, and kind of thinking about human rights in terms of culture, and also investing in that knowledge development. And we do see pockets of kind of where that is really changing the way that duty bearers and rights holders are interacting, which is the kind of ultimate goal of a human rights approach. So I shall leave it there because my phone is flashing at me.
Thank you so much for that, Sanchita, and a wonderful whistle-stop tour of the difference that BIHR are making. I'm going to move quickly on to our final speaker, who is Elena Ifalotti, and Elena coordinates the Human Rights Education and Training Unit of the Methodology, Education and Training section at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Before joining the United Nations in 1995, Elena worked both in universities and with several organisations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and also the Italian Refugee Council. So over to you, Elena.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much for inviting my office, which in short we call it the UN Human Rights Office, because as you saw how long was the names of these institutions. So the main office, the focus office of the United Nations in the area of human rights. Now, I hope to complement what has been said so far with my two main points. Next. I just want to make some remarks on methodology for human rights education, which I think it's very important, as well as the commitments made by states, all states, including obviously the UK, at the United Nations in the area of human rights education. But before doing so, I just want to say that right now our office has been really focusing on the question, is human rights education really effective? Meaning, is human rights education really able to empower people to protect human rights? And we have been looking at case studies and compiling them in compilation of good practices, but also producing movies on stories of people, young people, adults, who have been going through human rights education and whose life has changed because of that. And I just give you an example next of these stories, and you can Google this movie that we produced. The title is on the slide, A Path to Dignity, the Power of Human Rights Education, where we give some stories of the changes that human rights education has made in people's life, and for them to become human rights advocates from being human rights victims as they were at the earlier stage before knowing about human rights. What you see in the picture, her name is Premalata. And as you see in the smaller picture, that's her when she was 10 years old. And she is a girl from a rural village in Tamil Nadu of Dalit people. You know, Dalit is the low caste group in the Indian society. And the bigger picture that you see is 10 years later, when she came to speak at the UN Human Rights Council on the right to education, and particularly education, caste discrimination, and the right to education. And when she came to Geneva, it was, you know, a process that she had really gone through thanks to the human rights education programs that were running in the schools. And is a program run by People's Watch, a civil society organization in India, in Tamil Nadu in particular. So she came to our office and she said that, next. Before I was not aware of my rights. Now I'm aware of all of them. I have the courage to stand up for myself and to ask for my rights when I'm denied them. So you can know more about her stories and other stories through the movie, but just to say that we have been really, we really think that human rights education works. But however, which human rights education works? Because not all educational attempts are really effective. And I can tell you, you know, I've seen many different programs all over the world, and the results and the impact of those programs is very different. It's very different because methodology, the right methodology, is key. Next. First of all, what is human rights education? What are we talking about? Of course, we are talking about knowledge, as it was mentioned here. Learners would develop knowledge about human rights and the mechanism of protection. Next. We are talking also about skills, developing skills so that learners develop skills to identify and address human rights concerns. Next. And also there is an aspect of human rights education that works on the attitudes of the learners. The learners can reinforce positive attitudes, but also combat negative attitudes to be able to uphold human rights. Because the objective, as it was mentioned before, is next, to change behaviors and to make sure that learners take action to protect and promote their human rights and those of others. Next. So educational processes in human rights education has to be built around the actual learners. And we need to adopt a learner-centered methodology. Next. It has to be relevant to the learners. So everything starts with the learners. Who are the learners? Their age, education, experience, and so forth. And where are these learners? Where do they come from? So human rights education has to build on the human rights principles embedded within the learner's cultural context. Every culture, every history of countries has some human rights education inspiration that you can draw from in human rights education. Next. In terms of methodology, human rights education has to engage learners in a dialogue about how to apply the human rights framework to their own situation and use participatory methodologies, particularly peer learning, for instance, young people with young people, judges with judges, police with police, civil servants with civil servants, as trainers and learners together. Because again, we need to tackle this particular culture also around the group that is the target of our educational effort. Of course, I cannot speak more about this, but next. I'm happy to share these results that our office has developed from planning to impact, a manual on human rights training methodology, which really brings together about 40 years of human rights education and training with different target audiences throughout the world. Now I'll move to the second part. I don't know how much of you know, we have around 30 people here. And I'm wondering if Anmol knows, because actually I'm going to refer to human rights education for youth, that at the United Nations, the member states, all governments, decided to adopt specific frameworks, like the World Program for Human Rights Education, which was adopted in 2004 to start in 2005. Okay, 7 minutes. And is organizing consecutive efforts and focusing on national implementation. So member states are adopting programs internationally to improve human rights education nationally. As you see, this world program has different phases, and the current phase, the fourth phase, is dedicated to human rights education for youth. Next. Member states have also adopted big principle documents like the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, which reaffirms the responsibility of governments to promote and ensure human rights education. Next. Next. Here you have two quotes from the declaration, but just to say that states not only have to ensure human rights education and to provide human rights education, but also to create enabling environments for the engagement of civil society in human rights education. Next. I think, my two key points, again, the importance of the methodology used for human rights education and the fact that governments have made commitments at the UN on human rights educations are there. Anything more you want to explore in this area and in the work of the UN in this area, you can find it through our website, as well as writing to our own email address. Thank you.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much for that, Elena, and thank you to all our speakers. I think that was a really interesting, really diverse look at very different aspects of human rights education, lots of overlapping. It's going to be over to you folks on the floor if you have any questions in a moment. But firstly, just a huge thank you, and just a reminder that all these presentations will be uploading that to the resource section. So don't worry too much, you'll be able to access them there. And Sandra, I see you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, is there a UN strategy for engaging with civil society at all? to yes, get this agenda off the ground in the right place, because those 4 areas that that the last slide shows doesn't include NGOs and civil society organizations for some reason.
Thanks, Sandra. I think, Elena, that's for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, we work closely with the NGO Working Group on Human Rights Education and Learning at the Council, which is a coalition of civil society organizations who are advocating for human rights education at the UN level. You know, this is a group advocating at the UN level to push for the human rights education agenda internationally. Of course, at the national level, civil society is very much active in advocating their national governments on pushing the human rights education agenda. I see, for instance, that, you know, there is a representative from Amnesty International here. They are part of this NGO working group, and they also regularly advocate at the country level for more and more human rights education. So yeah, civil society are, let's say, those also who provide us with the information on what's going on very often in the countries, because we receive reports from governments on what they do, but also we receive information from civil society on what is happening or what could happen. You know that there are a number of UN mechanisms that can be reached out to. We were talking about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for instance. You know, Anmol was talking about it. There is a way of bringing human rights education concerns to the convention, for instance, in terms of what is being done for human rights education of children or about children's rights in a country to the committee who oversees the convention implementation. So yes, we do work with civil society, but at the same time, civil society has a big role of advocating for human rights education nationally too.
Could I come back, please?
Sure, let's keep it quick if we can, but yeah, go ahead, Sandra.
Yes, I thank you for the response. I am deeply familiar with the children's rights movement, and the problem with that, as it panned out in England, was there was one organization that was doing reporting at national level, but the organizations that were actually dealing with the ground levels had very, very limited input into what went up nationally. So that's why I'm asking the question, could we learn from experience, is what I'm saying, and could we somehow reorganize the way that and that perhaps that's not for the speaker, but that's for BIHR and Just Fair. But yes, if we could reorganize the way that reports are presented, and where civil society organizations can feed into this agenda, then I think we can get a lot further, a lot more quickly, because in the UK, as you know, we still haven't got children's rights into domestic legislation, no matter what we've tried to do. So thank you for that.
Although worth noting, of course, that the UNCRC Scotland bill act is going to come into force in July this year. So
yes.
Did anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I might use my privilege as chair to ask a couple. Or did anybody want to reflect either upon your own experiences dealing with either rights holders, this kind of classes people that Kate calls the rights administrators, or indeed the duty bearers, and what that looks like on the ground for you folks or within your own work? So any reflections or thoughts on that, very welcome. Otherwise, I do just want to jump in. And actually, I'm going to say as well, I forgot to say to the panel, you are very welcome as well to ask each other questions, because this occurred to me that stuff may have been sparked. But Hannah, I'll go over to you.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, it was just a quick question. So we've got an opportunity to be working with young people around, we're doing kind of a rights-based approach model with workshops, especially around sort of financial rights and things like that. And there's a various different topics that we've discussed. Now we're still, I'm joined with colleagues Gail and Nell on the call, but we're currently in the process of kind of bringing these things together. So I was just wondering, are there any sort of tools, resources, like worksheets or anything that's already been made as resources that might be useful for having these conversations? Obviously, given that there's a lot of experience in the room, in inverted commas, it'd be really useful. I know you mentioned the manual, Elena, but if there's anything as well, kind of looking at it from a legal perspective and framing of these conversations that ourselves and also other civil society organisations and VCSE organisations might be able to have with their groups would be really useful.
Would any of the panel like to come back on that? Elena?
Yeah, of course, I can talk from the global perspective because I would not have resources, informational resources, particularly from the UK necessarily. But, because the World Programme for Human Rights Education is specifically focusing on youth, human rights education for youth, we have a whole series of materials, including a movie that we just published together with Amnesty International and another civil society organization, which is called Changemakers, Stories of Young Human Rights Educators, which is stories of young people that, to inspire a discussion about human rights and the involvement of young people in human rights and human rights education. But there is a whole series of materials available for human rights education of young people, particularly from the methodology side, how to do it. And again, as I said, the peer learning is being always considered probably the best methodology in that sense. So what I can do is just to refer you to the page of our office on the 4th phase of the World Programme for Human Rights Education. But you can also write to that email, the one I showed in my presentation, and we can also respond to you with detailed resources. Again, it will be resources about human rights in general, not necessarily national legislation, because of course the colleagues on the panel are best suited for this specific information.
And Sanchita, I can see you have your hand raised as well.
Yes, I was trying to be really sneaky on my other screen and get some links to post in the chat, which I will do in a moment. There's a couple of sections on our website which are kind of around, where do my rights apply? And then it kind of links you through to what are my rights, and there's some kind of downloadable materials there, and we do a lot in easy read as well. So I think which kind of can be universally quite helpful for working with different groups. We've also got a couple of resources which have been specifically designed with young people, so co-produced. The content has been co-produced, and also the way they look. One of the young people did the artwork for the resource. It's specifically around kind of mental health and inpatient issues, but with most of our resources, what it also has is like some overall general information about the legal framework and how kind of young people would talk about that. So there's kind of, while the specific issue is maybe not quite what you're working on, the kind of general information about kind of rights and the law is quite helpful. And as I say, that's been kind of co-produced with young people, so that kind of hopefully would be useful too. So I will find the link and put it in the chat.
Thank you. That's brilliant.
Thank you. And Anmol and Kate, did either of you want to come back on that?
I didn't really have anything specifically to add to that, but I just wanted to say to Sandra, the point that you make about the way that finding ways so that civil society could feed into the agenda and progress things in the UK is really important. And that's really what we're hoping in many ways to come out of these discussion series, which is to sort of collectively build towards a position on how we can incorporate rights into domestic law across the UK, sort of using we were talking about it through this idea of these principles that we have at Just Fair to sort of guide that discussion process. But there will be later in the year a call for sort of contributions in writing to that process. And there's also been opportunities in the past that we have coordinated in terms of coordinating reports to the ICESCA committee, and that's likely to come up in the next round as some probably early next year as well. So it'd be really good to be in touch if you do have things that you want to say, and that we can maybe participate together in building those ideas. And that's a sort of invitation that's extended to everybody on this call.
And just to say, I see there's a lot of resources being popped into the chat. People are exchanging email addresses, so you folks far away with that. I am going to be parochial and mention the Children's Law Centre in Northern Ireland, who have a whole interactive live chat on children's rights. I'll just drop the link in the chat there. I am going to jump in, if that's okay, as chair, and I'm going to ask just a question just to bring this back to that human rights knowledge and how that helps with actual realization on right to the ground. Could I ask each speaker maybe, or anybody else can jump in on this as well, thoughts on what is one thing that they think needs to happen if you can limit to one? Like in an ideal scenario, what would be, you're allowed to do anything you want, one thing can definitely happen, what would it be to increase that rights knowledge with the idea that it will really make a difference for rights holders on the ground? It's a bit of a silver bullet, but what's your silver bullet? Anmol, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of referred to it in my speech at the beginning, but definitely like early intervention. Like I feel like people, definitely not the people in this call, because it's really great all the resources being shared and hearing all about your work, but just generally people who I've worked with definitely like overlook young people. I'm talking like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I work with a group of young people who are age 7 to 15, and I mean, is as young as 5, sorry, from 5 years and up. And they're also, they're just all great, and they have so much to say, they have so much knowledge. And so I really think, and one of the things I do is ensuring that they know about their children's rights. And I really think that is important, but I think it should be like a statutory provision. I don't know if that's the right word, but in terms of like, it should be in schools, like it shouldn't be like optional. Especially for young people. So that would be my thing.
Thank you so much. And Suki, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. And just actually building off what Anmol was saying, so my background comes from children's rights, working with Scottish Youth Parliament and UNICEF up in Scotland, and I had the privilege of visiting some schools that were, I think they were at gold or platinum level of their Rights Respecting Schools award. So they'd built rights right into the education system, and just like what Anmol was saying, actually I found that children really picked up on concepts of rights. So I remember going into classrooms where they were learning about rights, and I remember seeing a small 7-year-old girl riffing off from the top of her head exactly which number the right to water was. And it's like, I work in rights and I could not do that, but because these young children were so surrounded by the language of rights from a very young age, and it became second nature to them, I have no doubt that whenever they leave school, they become adults and become part of the working world, they are going to carry that knowledge, that language into their working environments and into whatever context they're going into as adults. So yeah, just to kind of, I guess, agree with what Anmol was saying in that, I think making sure that we're really embedding rights education from a very early age is probably the simplest answer we have to that question of how we create a rights culture.
Thank you for that. And Kate, I'm going to ask you in a wee minute to come back on that, because I think that's really interesting what it means for the rights administrators and the duty bearers, because obviously these kids grow up to fulfill many roles in society. But Sanchita, jump over to you quickly.
Helen, it's almost like you're in my brain. So that's kind of partly what I was going to say, is that I think human rights education, it's important for kind of all of us as individuals to kind of know that, to like, people leave school and kind of, you know, with a real lack of understanding of like what their rights are, but also, you know, like how government works, kind of, you know, how you can advocate for yourself, how you can speak up and be heard. But also those are also the people who go on to be duty bearers as well. I mean, I sit in rooms with people who have been, you know, commissioning the health services that we all access for the last 30 years, who have never had a conversation about human rights. So it does have to start kind of really young. But my flag with that would be that it can't just be general. It has to be really specific. It has to be kind of very focused on human rights, on accountability. We used to have in the national curriculum kind of a bit more targeted kind of commitment to rights education in the national curriculum. And it was hard even then when we had more kind of in there, but that's now mostly stripped out so that it can become a very kind of nebulous concept and principle, and that doesn't really help anyone.
Thank you so much for that. And Elena, you're next with your hand up.
Yeah, the issue of institutionalization of human rights education, particularly in formal education, primary, secondary, higher education, vocational training, you know, everywhere, basically, is exactly what has been said, as a priority probably, while continuing human rights education in non-formal education, like the work that is done by civil society and so on. But also, to me, it's very important to, you know, to nurture bridges between the law world and the education world, because unfortunately, sometimes they work in separate silos, let's say. So either they come the legal language, or it come the educational aspect, and without covering the rights, legal kind of aspect. So to me, these two words working more strictly together would make really a great improvement. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Elena. Kate, I'm going to come to you directly for a response now, and then I've got a comment in the chat I want to read, and then we'll do Samantha and Sandra.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, no, just I agree with everything that the others have said, and I think that point of trying to sort of bring about a change and create a rights culture, and starting with young people, and ensuring sort of rights education, civic education in sort of civics as well, understanding how government, how accountability, these things work is really critical. And this issue around the role that people administering rights, they're not necessarily the decision makers, they're not, you know, they're people who are part of the process that can inadvertently become blocks to rights realization simply because they don't know, or they don't understand the role that they're playing in that process. So it's critical, and I think the idea of it sort of steeping up and just because it's been so ingrained through people's lives is great. But I think my sort of other point would be that is a really good idea. That's the long-term plan for bringing a sort of significant change in culture. But there also sort of needs to be an interim plan, I think, because we need people's rights to improve sooner rather than later, not wait for the young people to grow up, as integral and fundamental as their role is going to be. And also make sure that people who are no longer in compulsory education don't miss out on that opportunity to receive information and knowledge about their rights. So I think in a sense, we needed a twin track approach, which is, yes, do that, but also are there other mechanisms that we can put in place to ensure that there is sort of a complementary model for people who are already part of the workforce, or even beyond, so that they're not left out of this process and this important sort of change that we're trying to bring about.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to read a comment here from Rona that says, access to grassroots, local, independent advocacy for people who have the greatest barriers to having their rights realised, helps increase rights knowledge for people in groups, but also holds public services to account on specific decisions they're making. And then I'm also going to suggest, if people are happy enough, I might upload a lot of the resources you're sharing in the comments onto that resource page we have, and I'll try to send them out by email as well, because there's a lot of really great stuff in there. Samantha, over to you.
So I was just, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry, I tried to switch my video off, but it's not. Sorry, I can't get my screen on. Oh, sorry. I work for the RNIB, but I'm actually going to comment as a parent of 2 children who went to a rights respecting school. And what I would say, I thought it was great that they learn about their rights, and obviously a little bit annoying at home sometimes when they when they told me they had various rights to things. But what I think would have been really great is if, obviously I knew it was a rights respecting school and I knew that they were learning about that, but it didn't, you could have actually done so much more with parents, because I think that they learn these rights, and I think one of the other speakers referred to them being able to sort of recite them. But I think when they're that young, they don't necessarily see how it will affect them, affect their day-to-day lives. And I suppose one of the reflections I was thinking when Amol spoke was that whilst my kids might have learnt about it when they were at junior school, actually when they needed to know about it, or when they need to know about it, is probably as they go into secondary school and they learn much, and that's when they start to have much more of an awareness about, about their personal situations and what their rights should be. So, and I think it's a shame. I had made a little note to ask my kids' secondary school whether they are a rights respecting school, because I've never heard that they are. So I think, I just think that there's a role for parents, but also to make sure that when you have those initiatives that they actually carry on through the education system. Thank you.
A really great point, Samantha. And Sandra, did you want to come in?
Yes, please, very quickly. I hope I didn't miss it, but and hopefully others are aware that Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, just, I think it was last week or the week before, announced a rights respecting schools pan-London project. Everybody,
if anybody has a link,
shocked into silence.
Drop it in the chat, because I missed that, Sandra.
Okay, I'll find it for you.
Thank you so much. And Nell, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect a little bit about what was said a second ago about reciting rights in terms of rights education. It does feel a little bit top down. Like there's a difference between knowing that you have a right to a voice and then knowing that you have a voice, especially as a child. I feel like I was someone that really benefited from political action as a young person, and it sort of the idea that you have a right to a voice, it's all very well and good telling that to people, but then when you experience it and know it, that's all very different. So yeah, I was impressed by the participatory methods when you talked about rights education, and I was wondering, I was wondering if there were any examples of how you can actually implement that into classrooms, for example, with children, like how when you're teaching children, rather than just getting them to recite things and telling them that they have rights, how can you make that a participatory environment where they can learn it a little bit differently? And that's anyone in the room.
Well, I really want to pick on you, if you wouldn't mind, about how you now talk to young people about rights and how that works. But you can tell me no if you want to.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't have like a set framework. I think it's, I don't know how helpful my answer will be, but I'll definitely open it to the rest of the room as well. But something that I do, so like I said, I work with a group aged 5 to 15, and I guess it's a kind of like, so the first thing that we do before we even get into rights and all of that is really like understanding the group. I think that's something that's like really overlooked in terms of like understanding what the children's needs are, and their different personalities, the way they like to learn. And like very much the simple like we have kind of simple rules like no jargon, no, you know, all that kind of thing. But what we do is we make it like really creative. Like that's something that I think works well with, like, I'm talking about a younger group, but yeah, making it as like creative as possible. We do like a lot of arts and crafts, and it's really funny because one time we were doing like a little film of the group, and the interviewer asked one of the young people, what do you do like at these sessions? And they were like, oh, we just have fun, like we play games. But actually that wasn't the purpose of the group, but it was nice to that's what they thought. I think you have to be like obviously really conscious that, you know, these the young people I work with have, you know, a array of lived experiences. So, you know, you can't just be talking about like, I don't know, trafficking or something like, you know, immigration in the way that we would with adults. So yeah, there's not like a set guideline, I think. But I feel like I've created one now, like in my head, for this group. So yeah, I don't know how helpful that is, but I'm happy to kind of take it away and maybe have a further chat if need be.
That's so useful, Amal. And I think like as a mum of a nearly 5-year-old, that like I really stick to that. Like play is the work of childhood. Like the work she should be doing right now is playing and is learning through play. So appreciate that. And Sandra's dropped the link into the chat. Elena, I see you have dropped a whole lot of practical activities in as well. So thank you for that. Sanchita, did you want to join in?
Yeah, I was just
sorry, could I just add that it's the link to the Twitter announcement, and I can't find easily the link on the UNICEF web page, but it will be there somewhere.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sandra. I appreciate the effort. And Sanchita.
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of the work that we've done with young people, and like one of my projects at the moment is actually working with a group of young people directly. And I think in terms of methodology, I think it's also like it's quite similar to how we would work kind of with adults, in that you meet people where they are, and that's your guiding principle. So you kind of understand kind of who it is that you're working with, what are the issues that they're kind of facing, and how do you then kind of relate sort of what people are experiencing or kind of what you're there to discuss to the rights kind of that actually you then want to talk about, but then what does that mean in action, and like really drawing on like, you know, real experiences and real stories. Like, so we have like quite a clear rule at Be Our Child where anything that we're talking about is not made up, because actually you don't want to be hit with, well, that wouldn't happen in real life, because you can kind of show how it has happened in real life, and sort of drawing on those examples from practice. So I think it's about sort of taking responsibility for meeting people where they are and doing things that are kind of real and relevant for them, that kind of maps to human rights law.
Thank you so much. And I see, Graham, we have a comment from you. We need to have adequate budgets and resources allocated to make sure that human rights education becomes meaningfully incorporated into education. An excellent point. And more and more activities and resources being shared. And Melanie says, I don't think there's any from the Equality and Human Rights Commission here, but they've produced some useful materials on children's rights and human rights more generally on their website. Totally support the need for compulsory rights and citizenship education in schools, but also a programme of public education and focused training for duty bearers would be useful to discuss the role of national human rights institutions. That would include the Equality and Human Rights Commission here, and the regulators and ombudsmen. Does anybody have a comment on that, in terms of any of the speakers or anyone else, in terms of what role the national human rights institutions have to play? Certainly, I know, being a child from Northern Ireland who is entering secondary school in 1998, I know that my NHRI, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, had a role to play in my knowledge about human rights coming out of a post-conflict society. But any reflections, Sanchita, Elena, Kate, Anmol, on the role of NHRIs in this?
I mean, maybe I'll start off, conscious that I am talking a lot, so I won't kind of say too much. But I think it's really significant. I think the whole point of an NHRI is to kind of secure the promotion and protection of human rights, and human rights education has to be a key element of that. I think there are also questions kind of to be raised about how that works. I've done a lot of that work. Some of those resources that have been flagged are ones that my organisation has worked on. And I will say that I think that NHRIs also need to think about how they work in a way with community groups and voluntary sector organisations that's also human rights respecting and is not kind of like contract procurement driven. I think that can make it really challenging. But I think that there's a real kind of role for that, and also ombudsmen and regulators as well. I mean, that's kind of something that we're also doing, is that sort of working with not just the duty bearers, or I think Kate kind of just talks about, like, was talking about administrators as well. There are lots of people in that chain, and we do have lots of different accountability mechanisms that we could be working with, but we have, you know, we have lots of ombudsmen in the UK across the kind of jurisdictions. Not all of them are talking about human rights, but they could have a huge lever.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that question around NHRIs, ombudsman? Okay, otherwise I do have one other question coming through, and that is, what could the practical measures and policies be to achieve better human rights knowledge, apart from, because we've already, I think, discussed quite a lot, that human rights education in schools. Does anybody want to tackle that? Go ahead, Elena.
Maybe just to say that, of course, when we talk about institutionalization of human rights education in the school system, we are talking about a system. We are not talking about just actual schools, right? So this is a complex undertaking, which is about policies and legislation. It's about teacher training, but also training of other education personnel, which was mentioned already here, because, you know, you may have a great curriculum and then teachers are not able to deliver it, or they do, again, recite, they ask children to recite numbers of articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is, you know, meaning losing those children forever to human rights. You need an enabling environment for human rights education, which means a school and a classroom where human rights principles are respected and practiced. And you need, of course, all type of implementation measures that come with policy making, which is, you know, budget, plans, and the responsibilities and so on. In this case, I mean, talking about this, you know, I would make the example, for example, in the Philippines, where the National Human Rights Commission, we were talking about the national institution, came into an official, you know, like a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Education, which is called, I think, Department of or Secretary of Education, I don't remember. But just to say that the whole idea would be that because we are talking about a system, it's very complex. It's not just, again, activities. And by the way, I didn't talk about the textbook, the curriculum, all these support tools for human rights education in school. So being this a very complex and broad undertaking, the infusion of human rights education in the formal education system, the more the actors are involved, the better it is. Again, in the Philippines, for instance, there was the National Human Rights Institution, Amnesty International Philippines, Ministry of Education. They came up with MOUs, bringing together the main actors at the country level, working on human rights education to build together a plan of action for the school system. I've been involved a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, in an initiative in Ireland and in the UK on bringing together trade unions of teachers, the local Ministry of Education, I'm not sure what was the name of that institution, as well as Amnesty International, to also infuse human rights education in school. So what I'm saying is that even if the responsibility is usually with the Ministry of Education or type, whatever is called the institution, the governmental institution, whether it's a central government or you know, state versus federal governments and so on. But then, you know, the real, because it's a big effort, it should really bring together all main partners.
Yeah, we're really working across. One interesting initiative I remember possibly from about 10 years ago in Northern Ireland was there was philanthropically funded, which is not the best way, but you know, you take what you can, but human rights education of the civil service, of civil servants, of key civil servants in Northern Ireland. And I think that was a really interesting progress in terms of, like, as we're saying, these rights administrators, these rights duty bearers, really understanding not just that they have a duty, but also giving them, unleashing their ability to work towards a better Northern Ireland. And it really was framed like that. It was about giving them the ability to push for something better and see how human rights could be part of that process, as well as being a duty, also being an opportunity. Sandra, I'm going to come to you, and then Melanie, I'm going to come to you.
Yes, sorry to keep
You are very welcome, Sandra. Thank you.
But the reason I'm so, and again, picking up on Elena's point about links to policy, the Mayor of London's announcement is linked directly to their violence reduction policy, which is just, I nearly fell off my chair when I saw it, because it's so absolutely on point. And they've started, I'm going to send you another article, a BBC report on the first school, I guess, who are adopting it and taking it forward. But it's directly linked to the violence reduction unit and their policies.
Thank you so much. And Sandra, I can see you've dropped that in the chat, so I'm really looking forward to getting a read of that. Melanie, did you want to come in?
I probably said most of what I wanted to say in the chat, actually. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I don't know why my hand won't work. I just think there's something about kind of, there's civil society, there's government, there's NHRIs, that, you know, there's all these actors here, and there's professionals and schools. And what we haven't got is a sort of overall picture of who should be doing what in this space, but in order to, you know, kind of really embed these values that we all share, you know, so that people understand them and know how to use them. So I think there's, you know, some really useful further thinking to do, and particularly around sort of ombuds and regulators, where JCHR did a piece a while back on whether we need a sort of human rights ombuds, and it concluded no, it needs to be embedded in the existing system, but the existing system is so, in England, it's better in Scotland and Wales, but it's so complex that people you know, don't know where to turn. So I think there's just loads of structural things that we could be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Melanie. And Sanchita?
Yeah, I think nicely leading on from that, kind of just thinking like about that JCHR report, I think it was quite interesting because although they concluded no, off the back of that, we are working with 2 ombudsmans. So I think there's also something about like the asks that we're making, even if kind of, you know, what they, you know, it's not translating into maybe the ideal, it can still be used as a push for change on knowledge. Because my ideal would be every single piece of new law has on it a statement that says what the Human Rights Act says, which is that this law needs to be applied in a way that is compatible with human rights, because that was in the COVID law, the Coronavirus Act. The very next day, my organisation was inundated by county councils, local councils, social work departments across the country who were like, oh no, we don't actually know how to do that, and now we have to do it in an emergency. So my idea would be every law has that, and that's a good impetus. But also, which I think, Melanie, you might have mentioned in your comments, is that kind of for any profession that is a human rights duty bearer, it needs to be part of your qualification and your CPD that you don't just know human rights, but you know how to do it in your job. And then I wouldn't have to work at BIHR, and I could go and bake cakes all day, and I'd be really happy about that.
That is really a beautiful future you've painted, Sanchita, but also an excellent point you make, and interesting how something can spark so much action. Did anybody else want to jump in with anything else? Otherwise, I have a bit of a question to panel members, and they can tell me that's far too specific. I don't know. But obviously, Scotland is now looking at, we have the UNCRC Act, we have the Human Rights Scotland bill being drafted. And I'm just wondering if any of the speakers, or indeed anybody in the room who might be a bit immersed in this, maybe not everybody's as obsessed with it as I am, and that's fine, but have they done any thinking about what the human rights knowledge needs are in terms of making sure that when that bill becomes an act, it actually has relevance for people on the ground and it actually makes an impact for them? Sandra, do you want to jump in first?
Yes, it's me again. Sorry to bang on. Yeah, what we had in England was a strategic litigation strategy, which there were some wins, but not many. But I think it was because there wasn't a kind of overarching sense of why this is necessary, which I do believe that there is now. So I think in conjunction with strategic litigation in Scotland, I'll give the one example I know of. There's a thing called the gangs matrix in London mainly, but across England, and they've used, I think it was Liberty, used the public sector equality duty to argue that children's rights Black children's rights in particular were being violated by the gangs matrix. And so because of the vehicle of the public sector equality duty, I mean, that's hugely strategic. So if Scotland can kind of take that approach forward, there are some big wins to be won, hopefully.
Thank you so much for that, Sandra. And I've quite a few hands raised, so I want to get through them because we've got only 8 minutes left. The time is flowing in. I've just popped the survey in the chat. If people could give us some feedback, it'll take 2 to 3 minutes. But over to you, Rona.
Thanks so much, Helen. Yeah, it was just to raise one of the recommendations that came out of the Scottish Mental Health Law Review that we think could be really helpful under the Scottish Human Rights Bill around collective advocacy groups having access to courts, so that people can raise kind of collective human rights issues. Obviously, the recommendations related to kind of mental health and capacity law, so it was a bit more specific than the broader kind of human rights, but I think that could be a really interesting area and one that could really help with accountability and with making sure that it's people's actual kind of human rights on the ground that are addressed. I think you can really see that in kind of local level collective advocacy groups where often it's like quite specific issues that are raised, and if you know that they're having those kind of human rights knowledge built from a kind of collective perspective, it can be really helpful in making sure that there's those rights issues are addressed.
Thank you so much for that, Rona. Really, really interesting reflection. Santita?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute and then talking away, which is not helpful. I think I was going to say strategic litigation, I think, is really important, and access to courts is really important. But when we responded to the Scottish Government consultation, one of the things we were really keen to say is that you can't just rely on court action, because court action is for when it's already gone wrong. You actually have to have a preventative approach as well, which is about trying to stop it from going wrong in the first place, which is about empowering both individuals and duty bearers. And as much as I love the Human Rights Act, I think one of the biggest issues with it was that when it came in, there was a small period of reflection for organisations to get ready for complying with the duties in the Human Rights Act. And apparently that 18 months was enough to last us forever. And that I think is one of the really big mistakes, is that this is not a one-off. Part of the process has to be implementation. I think generally in policy and law, we're really good at going shiny, shiny, shiny new over here. Let's move on to the next thing. Shiny, shiny new won't do anything if we don't focus on implementation with just as much, if not more, commitment and resource.
And that leads me very nicely. I'm going to come to you in a second, Alice, but just to mention that our next session is going to be on human rights frameworks, where we will be hearing from citizens' advice in terms of the issues that people currently have in terms of accessing rights, and also the Human Rights Consortium Scotland are going to be speaking on their recent report on, actually the parallel report from people with lived experience on accessing justice at the moment to rights. But just to pass over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, our consultation response to the bill was really focused on the capacity building element. And yeah, it's building on Santita's point as well about implementation being a core part of that rollout of the bill, especially because the bill at the moment seems that it's very focused on the public sector, but not thinking about the dual responsibility and dual duty that the third sector in Scotland's going to have, both through being duty bearers, through being contracted through the public sector, but also through representing communities, especially as there's so much talk in the bill around engaging with stakeholders, with people with lived experience as part of the policies that are going to be put in place, and but in the monitoring and how that's going to work. And the third sector are likely going to be the people kind of facilitating that and making those connections. So yeah, having that capacity element, it's probably also useful if anyone is interested in that, for me to kind of plug my organisation, what we do, and our resources. I can see my colleague Suki's just put us in the chat, and we do capacity building stuff for the third sector, which is why I'm talking about this. And so we're helping to try and support human rights culture within Scotland's third sector and create training and resources for that. But we're just one little organisation kind of like shouting for this. It'd be really great to see the government, Scottish government and UK government, actually engage more with the third sector and be able to really put them at the heart of policy making. Because at the moment, it does feel like a little bit of an afterthought, where actually they're going into the implementation phase and then going, oh, hang on, actually, we don't have the connections of the community to be able to make this real and to make this something that people can actually access. And so if they could plan us in a bit further, you know, really think about the third sector, that I think that would do a world of good.
Thank you so much for that reflection. And yes, check out Three's website, and everybody. We only have 2 minutes left, so do any of our speakers want to give any final thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, so that leaves me just to say an absolutely huge thank you, firstly, to all our 4 speakers. I feel like you brought such a diversity and such a depth of knowledge to this discussion on human rights knowledge, so huge thank you to that, but also a huge thank you to everybody else in the room, because this wouldn't have been a discussion without all of you bringing your separate views and your separate knowledge. And thank you so much, because that chat is now just a wealth of resources. If everybody's happy enough, I'm going to pull some of those to share them with everybody. Check out our resource page, fill in the survey, and join us for the next session on the 20th of March, because this is all about a series of discussions. So thank you all so very much, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. And enjoy your deep day tomorrow, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.